A few years ago, after a messy breakup and feeling the urge for a fresh start, I moved cross-country to a quiet town in Maine. I found a small, charming cottage on the edge of town, surrounded by thick woods and a picturesque lake nearby. The place seemed ideal, a perfect retreat to heal, reflect, and reset my life. My neighbors were friendly but kept mostly to themselves, leaving me with ample solitude, which I greatly appreciated. Initially, I enjoyed the solitude immensely, spending my days working remotely from my laptop, hiking through the woods, or relaxing by the lakeside. However, about a month after moving in, I began noticing small but unsettling details that hinted I might not be entirely alone in my peaceful sanctuary. One morning, I stepped onto my porch to find footprints leading from the woods directly up to my front door. They weren't mine, nor were they those of any animal I recognized. A chill raced down my spine, but I convinced myself it was a curious neighbor or hiker passing through. Still, to ease my mind, I installed a simple security camera aimed at the porch. Over the next few nights, the footage showed nothing unusual, and I began to relax again. Until about a week later when I reviewed the footage after noticing the footprints again. The camera captured a figure standing silently on the porch, just outside the view of the door's peephole, unmoving, for hours. Terrified, I reported the incident to local police, who promised to patrol the area more frequently, but nothing definitive came of it. Feeling vulnerable, I added extra locks, motion-sensing lights, and alarms. Despite my precautions, I constantly felt uneasy, especially at night. Sleep became elusive, every creak of the old cottage amplified, every shadow suspicious. One evening, as a storm raged outside, I heard a distinct tapping on my window. Heart pounding, I cautiously pulled back the curtain to find nothing there but the darkness and rain. Yet the tapping persisted, shifting from window to window around the house. Determined to confront whoever or whatever tormented me, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, into the storm. The woods around my cottage loomed ominously in the moonlight, branches swaying violently in the wind. My flashlight beam danced erratically, illuminating shadows that seemed to shift unnaturally. As I circled my house, I spotted a small figure darting quickly between the trees. Chasing instinctively after the figure, I moved deeper into the woods, suddenly aware of how isolated I'd become. After several frantic minutes, I stopped, realizing I'd lost my bearings entirely. The storm intensified, the wind howling, rain pelting me relentlessly. Panic started to creep in as I desperately searched for familiar landmarks. Suddenly, from behind me, came the unmistakable crunching of footsteps. Turning sharply, I saw a shadowy figure standing motionless, just at the edge of my flashlight beam. Their face obscured by a hood, they simply stood and watched. I called out, demanding to know who they were, but they didn't respond. Instead, they began slowly walking towards me. Fear surged through my veins as I turned and ran blindly, branches whipping my face, roots snagging my feet. After what felt like an eternity, I burst through the trees and emerged back at my cottage, soaked and terrified. Locking myself inside, I called the police again, waiting anxiously until dawn. Officers searched the area thoroughly, but found no trace of the mysterious figure. Unable to shake the experience, I moved shortly thereafter, no longer feeling safe in that quiet, isolated home. Even today, the thought of what or who had watched me from the shadows remains unsettling, reminding me how quickly peaceful solitude can turn into chilling isolation. I moved into an affordable duplex in a bustling suburb outside Chicago. It seemed perfect for my needs, a comfortable space, friendly neighbors, and conveniently close to my office. The house was older, with creaky wooden floors and walls thin enough to occasionally overhear my neighbors, but nothing I couldn't handle. Everything was normal at first, and I quickly settled into a routine of work, errands, and evenings relaxing at home. But a few months in, subtle changes started catching my attention. Items in my apartment seemed slightly out of place when I'd come home from work. My mail on the opposite side of the table, kitchen cabinets partially open, or furniture shifted just enough to notice. Initially, I blamed my own forgetfulness, convinced stress was making me careless. One night, however, my unease turned to genuine fear. I awoke around 2:30 a.m. to the distinct sound of footsteps directly above me. The apartment above mine had been vacant for months, something I was certain about, having seen the landlord show potential tenants around just days earlier. The footsteps continued, pacing quietly across the ceiling, pausing occasionally as if someone was carefully listening or inspecting something. Unable to ignore it, I got out of bed, grabbed my phone, and decided to investigate. I slowly ascended the staircase leading to the upper apartment, my heart racing in the eerie silence. Reaching the door, I found it locked tight. Confused and shaken, I retreated, convinced I'd imagined the sounds or perhaps misunderstood where they came from. Over the next few weeks, the sounds persisted, becoming increasingly regular and unmistakable. Determined to uncover the truth, I reported my suspicions to the landlord, who dismissed it as settling noises from the old building. Frustrated and uneasy, I purchased a small security camera, discreetly placing it in my apartment, pointed toward the entryway. Days passed without incident, but one afternoon, reviewing footage during my lunch break, clearly visible, a stranger, a man I'd never seen before, entered my apartment shortly after I left for work. Calmly and casually, he wandered around my home, opening drawers, sitting on my couch, even eating from my refrigerator. He left as silently and casually as he'd entered, disappearing back upstairs. Immediately, I called the police, showing them the footage. They swiftly searched the upstairs apartment, discovering evidence that someone had been living there unnoticed for weeks. Food wrappers, clothing, and even personal items stolen from my apartment were scattered throughout. Though the intruder was never apprehended, the realization that someone had silently shared my space without detection terrified me deeply. I moved out shortly after, unable to shake the persistent fear that followed. To this day, the memory of that unknown presence lurking just above me remains disturbingly vivid, a chilling reminder of how easily our sense of security can be shattered. After graduating college, I rented a small bungalow in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. It was the kind of place where people waved as you drove past, and neighbors shared homemade cookies during the holidays. I loved the tranquility and the sense of safety it provided, especially being a young woman living alone for the first time. My first months in the new home were fantastic. I settled into a comfortable routine of work, yoga classes, and cozy evenings, binge-watching my favorite shows. My confidence grew each day, grateful for the independence and peace the place offered. But everything changed one unsettling night. It was past midnight when I first heard a faint tapping sound coming from the front door. At first, I brushed it off as wind or branches hitting against the house. Curiosity turned quickly into apprehension as I cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. There was nobody there. Convincing myself it was nothing, I returned to bed, shaken but determined to forget it. However, the tapping didn't stop. Night after night, around the same time, it began anew, growing increasingly insistent. Sleep became a struggle, my anxiety rising with each repetition of the mysterious sound. Eventually, I installed a video doorbell, hoping to catch whatever was responsible. The footage from the first few nights revealed nothing but an empty porch, increasing my frustration and fear. Then one night, the video captured something chilling. A person stood silently on my porch, partially hidden by shadows, gently tapping on my door with one finger. They wore a dark hoodie, obscuring their features. Watching the footage sent chills down my spine. Immediately, I called the police, who promised to increase patrols, but without a clear view of the person's face, there was little they could do. Days turned into weeks, and the visitor continued their nightly visits, always tapping, always silent. I felt trapped, constantly anxious, never fully at ease even during daylight hours. My peaceful refuge had become a place of dread. Eventually, determined to confront my tormentor, I stayed awake, sitting near the front door, waiting silently in the darkness. Sure enough, around midnight, the tapping started again. Heart pounding, I swung open the door, flashlight in hand, confronting the figure face to face. Startled, the intruder froze momentarily before darting away into the darkness. My heart racing, I locked the door, shaking uncontrollably as I called the police again. Despite thorough searches, authorities never caught the visitor, nor did they return after that night. However, the memory lingered, forever tainting my sense of security. Shortly afterward, I moved away, seeking peace elsewhere. A few years back, I accepted a job as a caretaker for a historical estate located just outside Savannah, Georgia. The property was stunningly beautiful, an elegant mansion surrounded by lush gardens, winding pathways, and ancient oak trees draped with Spanish moss. It felt like stepping into another era, quiet and isolated, yet filled with charm and character. Initially, the job was exactly what I'd hoped for, peaceful and straightforward. My tasks were simple: maintaining the gardens, checking security, and occasionally welcoming visitors interested in the estate's history. Living on site in a small guest house provided comfort and solitude, which suited my introverted personality perfectly. However, as weeks passed, I started noticing oddities around the estate. Doors I was sure I'd closed were found slightly ajar. Lights I knew I'd switched off mysteriously illuminated the next morning, and tools occasionally disappeared only to reappear in strange locations. At first, I rationalized these incidents as absent-mindedness or the quirks of an old property. But my unease steadily grew, becoming harder to dismiss. One afternoon, while exploring the mansion's sprawling basement, I stumbled upon something peculiar. A small, barely noticeable door partially concealed behind heavy shelving. Curiosity compelled me to clear away the obstacles and open the door, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Intrigued yet hesitant, I grabbed a flashlight and carefully descended the ancient, creaky stairs. At the bottom, I found myself in a hidden room, dimly lit by my flashlight's narrow beam. Dust covered everything, and it seemed untouched for decades. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old jars, boxes, and strange, antique-looking objects. In the center of the room sat an old wooden table, and on it lay an open diary, its yellowed pages covered in faded handwriting. Compelled by curiosity, I began reading. The entries detailed unsettling accounts of someone who'd lived on the estate years before, paranoid writings about being watched, items moving inexplicably, and mysterious visitors appearing on the grounds at night. As I read further, the author's distress and fear became palpable, their words frantic, describing encounters eerily similar to my own experiences. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed from upstairs, snapping me from my focus. Heart racing, I quickly closed the diary and rushed back up the stairs, slamming the hidden door behind me. Returning to the main part of the mansion, I found no one. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sensation heavier than ever. In the days following my discovery, disturbances around the estate intensified. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision. Strange whispers floated through empty halls, and I frequently awoke to the sensation of someone standing just beyond my sight. Driven nearly to panic, I revisited the hidden room, desperate to understand. Upon entering again, I found the diary closed neatly, a fresh flower placed carefully beside it. Fear surged through me, realizing someone, or something, had been there recently. Hastily grabbing the diary, I fled the room, locking myself inside the guest house to read the final entries. They described the author's growing madness and eventual disappearance, leaving the estate abandoned and forgotten. Unable to endure another night, I resigned the following morning, leaving the diary with local historians and never returning to the property. Yet, the haunting entries and unexplained events still trouble me deeply, forever changing my view of solitude. After college, I took a gap year to backpack through Europe. It was the adventure I'd always dreamed of, filled with excitement, new cultures, and a sense of freedom I'd never known. One evening, while staying in a quaint, picturesque village in southern France, I heard rumors of an abandoned railway tunnel located just outside town. Intrigued by stories from locals who claimed the place was haunted, I decided to see it for myself, dismissing their warnings as mere superstition. The following day, armed with nothing but my camera and flashlight, I set off toward the tunnel. It was a beautiful hike, the path winding through lush countryside dotted with wildflowers and gentle hills. However, as I approached the tunnel entrance, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The air grew cooler, heavier, and the birdsong faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. The tunnel loomed before me, a massive stone structure partially reclaimed by nature, vines creeping over its entrance like grasping fingers. Taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, I stepped inside, immediately feeling swallowed by darkness and echoing emptiness. The beam of my flashlight illuminated damp walls covered in graffiti, some of it playful, others unsettlingly cryptic. As I ventured deeper into the tunnel, the faint sounds from outside faded completely, replaced by the oppressive silence and the distant dripping of water. My footsteps echoed eerily, magnified by the confined space. The further I walked, the more the tunnel seemed endless, darkness stretching infinitely ahead and behind. Suddenly, a faint sound broke through my thoughts, a distant whisper, barely audible. Stopping abruptly, I listened carefully, heart pounding. Nothing but silence. Shaking off the momentary unease, I continued cautiously, my curiosity driving me onward. Yet moments later, the whispering returned, clearer this time, seeming to emanate from just beyond my flashlight's reach. Unnerved but determined, I called out, thinking perhaps someone else was exploring the tunnel. My voice bounced hollowly off the walls, answered only by silence and echoes. But then, unexpectedly, another voice responded, soft, chillingly calm, and disturbingly familiar. It whispered my name. Frozen with fear, I shined the flashlight frantically around me, the beam dancing across empty darkness. My breathing quickened and a cold dread gripped my chest. Before I could rationalize the experience, another sound emerged, this one unmistakable. Footsteps approaching from deep within the tunnel, steady and purposeful. Panic surged through me as I turned and bolted back toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing loudly, mingling with those behind me. Glancing back briefly, I saw nothing but felt an intense presence, something unseen closing in rapidly. My mind raced, desperately fighting to stay calm and focused. Finally, I burst from the tunnel entrance, sunlight momentarily blinding me. Breathless and shaken, I stumbled away, not daring to look back again until safely back in the village. The locals weren't surprised by my terrified state, only nodding knowingly, their warnings having gone unheeded. Though I left the village shortly after, continuing my travels elsewhere, the experience lingered, permanently altering my perspective on the unknown. Even now, years later, memories of the tunnel's darkness and the chilling echoes still haunt my dreams, making me question what truly lurks within the hidden, forgotten places of our world. A few winters ago, craving solitude and a break from city life, I booked a week-long stay at a secluded cabin deep in the mountains of Vermont. It was late December, and the landscape was picturesque, blanketed in thick snow and dotted with towering pine trees. The cabin itself was rustic but cozy, complete with a roaring fireplace, comfy furniture, and panoramic windows overlooking the peaceful woods. My first days there were pure bliss. I spent mornings hiking snowy trails, afternoons reading by the fire, and evenings cooking hearty meals in the tiny kitchen. I cherished the absolute quiet, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire or distant sounds of wildlife. However, by the third night, the atmosphere started feeling subtly different. It began with small things, a faint rustling in the woods at dusk or the occasional sense of being watched while I prepared dinner. Initially dismissing these feelings as isolation-induced paranoia, I continued enjoying my stay, determined not to let fear spoil my retreat. But one evening, as darkness fell and a fresh snowstorm blew outside, I distinctly heard footsteps crunching through snow outside the cabin. Heart racing, I peered cautiously through the frosted window but saw nothing except the swirling snow illuminated by porch lights. Unsettled, I locked the doors, checked all the windows, and told myself it was merely a passing animal. The following morning, however, brought undeniable evidence. A clear set of human footprints circling the cabin, pausing briefly outside each window and door. Anxiety twisted in my stomach, and I immediately called the property manager, who promised to investigate, but suggested it was probably just a curious hiker who had gotten lost. Despite the reassurance, sleep became impossible, and every small sound had me on edge. Then, late one night, while sitting by the fireplace reading to distract myself, I heard it clearly, a slow, deliberate knocking at the back door. Frozen with fear, I approached quietly, flashlight trembling in my hand. When I cautiously pulled aside the curtain, my heart nearly stopped. A figure stood motionless, cloaked in shadows, barely visible in the moonlight. My breath caught, and panic surged as the figure lifted a hand, knocking again slowly, rhythmically. Without thinking, I screamed, backing away quickly and dialing the local police, hands shaking uncontrollably. Officers arrived swiftly, thoroughly checking the property and surrounding woods, but finding no sign of the mysterious visitor. They assured me it was likely someone playing a cruel joke, or possibly a confused hiker. Unable to shake the terror of the encounter, I packed my belongings and left at first light, cutting my retreat short. Even back in the safety of the city, the memories continued haunting me, forever changing my perception of isolation and the tranquility of the wilderness. When I landed my first job out of college, I rented a modest apartment in a quiet neighborhood just outside Portland, Oregon. The area was peaceful, filled with friendly people and lined with quaint homes, each possessing a unique charm. Directly across from my apartment lived an elderly man named Mr. Wallace, who seemed harmless enough, though a bit odd. He rarely left his house, mostly keeping to himself behind drawn curtains. Initially, I paid little attention to him, absorbed in my new life and career. Occasionally, I'd notice him standing at his window, seemingly watching the street below. At first, it felt harmless, and I chalked it up to loneliness or simple curiosity. However, after a few months, I started noticing him specifically watching me, appearing at his window every time I left for work or returned home, his eyes following my every move. Feeling slightly uneasy, I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid. Yet, the more I observed, the clearer it became. Mr. Wallace's watchfulness had intensified into something unsettling. Lights in his house flickered on and off at strange hours, and occasionally I'd see him standing motionless outside my building, staring up at my window late at night. The intensity of his gaze sent chills down my spine. One evening, returning from a friend's place around midnight, I was startled to find Mr. Wallace standing in my apartment lobby, partially hidden in shadows. Nervously, I greeted him, but he said nothing, just continued staring silently, expressionless. Rattled, I quickly moved past him, locking my door immediately and peering anxiously through the peephole until he eventually shuffled away. After that night, things escalated rapidly. Notes began appearing at my doorstep. Vague, unsettling messages hinting at secrets Mr. Wallace believed we shared. Fearful, I reported it to the police, who spoke to him briefly but dismissed my concerns, attributing his behavior to age and isolation. Feeling increasingly vulnerable, I installed additional security measures, including cameras and reinforced locks. Then, one terrifying night, I awoke to the unmistakable sound of someone attempting to open my front door. Heart pounding, I grabbed my phone and silently dialed 911, whispering my situation frantically. Moments later, the sound stopped abruptly. Cautiously approaching the door, I peered through the peephole. Mr. Wallace stood just inches away, staring directly back at me, eyes wide and expressionless. Police arrived shortly after, catching him still outside my door. He offered no explanation, simply staring blankly ahead as they led him away. Authorities discovered unsettling evidence inside his home. Photos of me taken secretly over months, detailed notes about my daily routines, and even keys he had inexplicably obtained to my apartment. Though he was moved to a facility for psychiatric evaluation, the experience left me profoundly shaken, forever wary of those around me. I moved away shortly after, seeking safety and anonymity. But the haunting memory of Mr. Wallace's silent, obsessive watchfulness remains etched in my mind, a constant reminder of the hidden dangers lurking behind even the friendliest facades. A few summers ago, my best friend and I decided to take an epic cross-country road trip to celebrate our recent graduations. We planned our route meticulously, filled with exciting stops at national parks, quirky roadside attractions, and bustling cities. The trip started perfectly. Sunny skies, laughter, and endless music blasting through the car speakers. About halfway through our journey, we found ourselves driving late at night through an isolated stretch of highway somewhere in rural Kansas. It was pitch black, the only illumination coming from our headlights and the occasional distant flash of lightning from an approaching storm. Feeling exhausted but determined to reach our next stop, we pressed on, hoping to find a motel soon. Around midnight, with the storm now raging overhead, we spotted a dimly lit sign advertising a motel just a few miles ahead. Relieved, we pulled into the gravel parking lot. The place seemingly deserted except for one flickering neon sign and an old, beat-up truck parked near the entrance. The building itself looked worn, paint peeling, windows dusty, but we were desperate for rest. The front desk was empty, lit only by a dim, buzzing bulb. Ringing the bell brought forth a middle-aged woman who greeted us with an odd mixture of enthusiasm and unease. She quickly handed us a key, almost insisting we take a room toward the back, away from the road, claiming it would be quieter. Too tired to question, we accepted gratefully. As we settled into our room, a creeping sense of unease began to surface. The room was sparsely furnished and oddly damp, smelling faintly of mildew. The walls were thin, transmitting the sounds of the storm clearly. Exhaustion soon overtook anxiety, and we drifted into uneasy sleep. I woke abruptly around 3 a.m., startled by what sounded like voices outside our window. Heart racing, I sat up, straining my ears. Clearly someone was whispering urgently just beyond the thin curtains, their words unintelligible but the tone undeniably aggressive. Nudging my friend awake, we listened silently, barely daring to breathe. After several tense moments, The whispers ceased abruptly, followed by footsteps retreating quickly into the stormy night. Unable to shake our unease, we decided to leave immediately, despite the pouring rain and darkness. Quickly packing, we cautiously exited our room, freezing in place when we noticed the previously empty parking lot now had multiple unfamiliar vehicles parked haphazardly around ours. As we approached our car, figures stepped out of the shadows, moving toward us silently. Panic surged through us as we rushed into the vehicle, locking doors and fumbling to start the engine. Faces pressed briefly against our windows, pale and expressionless, staring intently. The engine roared to life and we sped away into the storm, hearts pounding, adrenaline fueling us far beyond exhaustion. We drove nonstop until daylight, finally pulling into a busy rest area filled with travelers and safety. Though shaken, we pushed onward, unwilling to fully acknowledge the narrow escape we'd experienced. To this day, the memories of that night linger, unanswered questions haunting us, a chilling reminder of how quickly a carefree adventure can spiral into a nightmare. After a rough financial patch, I found myself needing a roommate to afford my apartment in Boston. After several interviews, I settled on Ethan, a quiet, polite graduate student who seemed reliable and respectful. Initially, he was the perfect roommate, tidy, considerate, and mostly kept to himself, often studying late into the night. However, after a couple of months, I began noticing strange behaviors that, though subtle at first, gradually grew alarming. Ethan rarely left his room, emerging only briefly for necessities, often at odd hours. Occasionally, I'd find him standing silently in the kitchen or hallway in the dark, staring blankly at nothing, seemingly unaware of my presence. My discomfort grew, but I dismissed it, thinking he was just socially awkward or dealing with stress from school. Yet the situation escalated one evening when I came home unexpectedly early. Upon entering, I found Ethan standing motionlessly in my bedroom doorway, looking inside. Startled, I asked what he was doing, but he merely stared silently, expressionless, before slowly retreating to his room without a word. Feeling deeply unsettled, I decided to keep a closer eye on Ethan's behavior. Soon after, I began hearing faint whispers coming from his room late at night, hushed, hurried conversations, though I knew he rarely had visitors. Determined to find out more, I quietly approached his door one night, the whispers abruptly stopping as my footsteps drew near. My heart raced, an icy fear gripping me. Days later, while Ethan was out, I hesitantly entered his room, driven by a nagging suspicion I couldn't shake. Inside, I discovered something profoundly disturbing. Photos of me taken secretly, pinned to a corkboard alongside cryptic notes, obsessive observations of my daily habits, routines, and detailed records of my comings and goings. Terrified, I quickly gathered some belongings and immediately contacted the authorities. Ethan, sensing something was wrong, never returned to our apartment, vanishing without explanation. Police discovered he had falsified his background information completely, leaving behind no traceable past. Despite moving and rebuilding my life elsewhere, the haunting memory of Ethan's quiet obsession lingers. To this day, I'm cautious and wary, forever changed by the chilling realization that danger can live silently alongside us, hidden behind a quiet facade. 2 summers ago, I embarked on a solo hiking adventure along the Appalachian Trail, aiming to experience the solitude and beauty of nature firsthand. I meticulously planned my trip, ensuring I had enough supplies and mapping out safe resting spots along my route. The first few days were exactly as I'd hoped: breathtaking landscapes, peaceful solitude, and the satisfaction of each step forward. On the 5th day, as the sun began setting earlier than expected, I found myself rushing to reach a campsite marked on my map. Dusk settled quickly, casting long, eerie shadows across the dense forest surrounding me. Despite my initial calm, Anxiety started creeping in as the woods grew darker and unfamiliar sounds echoed through the trees. As darkness enveloped the trail, my headlamp became my sole comfort, illuminating only a small patch of ground ahead. Suddenly, from just beyond the edge of the light, I heard footsteps matching my pace, crunching softly in the leaves. Heart pounding, I turned sharply, shining the beam behind me, but saw only empty trail stretching into darkness. Convinced my mind was playing tricks, I quickened my pace, hoping to reach safety soon. Yet the footsteps continued, steady, patient, always slightly out of sight. Panic building, I forced myself onward, the shadows around me seeming to twist and shift unnaturally. Finally, I arrived at the campsite, relieved to find it empty, but undeniably eerie. Quickly setting up my tent, I tried to dismiss the unsettling events as exhaustion-induced paranoia. However, sleep evaded me, every small noise magnified by the darkness. Just as I began drifting off, a faint rustling outside my tent startled me awake. Frozen, barely breathing, I listened closely, unmistakably hearing someone pacing slowly around the perimeter. Gripped by fear, I silently reached for my phone, discovering I had no service. Desperate, I clutched my pocket knife tightly, waiting out the agonizing hours until sunrise. The footsteps eventually faded into silence, leaving me trembling and exhausted. At first light, I emerged cautiously, finding clear footprints circling my tent repeatedly. Horrified, I packed hastily, abandoning my original plans, and quickly retraced my path toward civilization. I never discovered who or what shadowed me that night, but the experience left an indelible mark, forever changing how I perceive the wilderness, turning my passion for solitude into cautious respect for what might be hiding unseen in the shadows. While working as a freelance photographer, I became fascinated with urban exploration. The allure of photographing forgotten places, abandoned structures, and hidden remnants of history was irresistible. One particular assignment led me to explore an abandoned hospital on the outskirts of Detroit, rumored to be haunted, though I remained skeptical of such claims. Arriving at the decrepit building early one foggy morning, I found it imposing yet captivating. Broken windows, graffiti-covered walls, and overgrown weeds gave it an unsettling but intriguing appearance. As I entered cautiously, the eerie silence enveloped me immediately, broken only by the distant dripping of water and my footsteps echoing off cold, tiled floors. I moved through empty corridors, capturing images of faded hospital equipment, rusted beds, and discarded files. Despite the building's deteriorated state, it felt oddly alive, as if it still held echoes of the past. After several hours, I ventured deeper into the building, reaching the hospital's basement, an area rumored to house old surgical rooms and the morgue. The basement air was colder, heavier, and a profound unease began settling over me. My flashlight barely pierced the oppressive darkness, illuminating sterile rooms with scattered remnants of past medical practices. The atmosphere became suffocating, every creak and groan of the old structure amplified in my ears. Suddenly, from behind me came a clear metallic clanging sound, like something heavy dropping onto the floor. Heart pounding, I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but found nothing visible. Rationalizing it as structural shifting, I continued cautiously, my curiosity battling my rising anxiety. Entering the morgue, my breath quickened as I scanned the rusted tables and abandoned equipment. A sudden movement caught my eye, a shadow darting swiftly across the room, disappearing behind one of the morgue's large storage cabinets. Terrified, I cautiously approached, shining the flashlight into every corner, revealing only emptiness. As I backed slowly out of the morgue, another sound emerged, soft whispers, indistinct yet undeniably human. Panic surged through me, compelling me to flee toward the stairwell. Reaching it, I found the door inexplicably jammed shut, trapping me momentarily in suffocating panic. Struggling desperately, I finally managed to force the door open, racing up the stairs and bursting out into the fresh air, gasping for breath. Trembling and shaken, I vowed never to return, abandoning the project completely. Right after graduating high school, I took a job working the night shift at a small, rundown motel located just off the interstate in Arizona. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and I enjoyed the quiet solitude the late-night hours provided. My responsibilities were straightforward: checking guests in and out, managing occasional phone calls, and keeping an eye on the property. At first, the shifts were uneventful, mostly filled with boredom and the occasional passing traveler. However, things began changing subtly after I'd been working there for about a month. It started with strange, late-night phone calls, no one speaking, only breathing softly before hanging up abruptly. Dismissing it as prank calls or line issues, I initially paid little attention. But the calls grew more frequent, always coming around the same hour, precisely 3:15 a.m. Simultaneously, I started noticing a figure loitering around the motel parking lot late at night. Always standing at a distance, the person never approached, simply watched silently from the shadows. Increasingly anxious, I reported the strange occurrences to my manager, who dismissed my concerns, claiming it was likely just a bored local causing trouble. Yet, each night brought growing unease. The figure became bolder, moving closer to the building each night, always disappearing swiftly if I attempted to investigate. One particular evening, my shift felt unusually tense from the start. The air seemed heavier, the silence more oppressive. Sure enough, at exactly 3:15 a.m., the phone rang again. Hesitantly, I answered, greeted only by familiar silence followed by faint breathing. This time, however, a low voice whispered my name before hanging up abruptly. Heart pounding, I glanced outside to see the figure standing directly under a flickering street lamp, staring intensely toward the lobby windows. Terrified, I immediately called the police, describing the situation frantically. As I waited anxiously, the figure stepped slowly toward the building, their face hidden beneath a hood. Moments later, police lights illuminated the parking lot, and officers swiftly apprehended the figure before he could flee. It turned out to be a former guest with a disturbing fixation, known for similar behavior elsewhere. The revelation both relieved and deeply unsettled me. Unable to continue working there, I quit immediately, deeply shaken by the ordeal. Years later, memories of those haunting nights still send chills down my spine, forever altering my perspective on solitude and the eerie, isolated quiet of night. During my first trip to New York City, I experienced something unsettling that still sticks with me. I was excited but overwhelmed by the city's sheer size, eager to explore, yet a bit nervous about navigating the subway alone. After spending the whole day sightseeing, I was heading back to my Airbnb in Brooklyn, exhausted and disoriented. I boarded what I believed was the correct subway line and felt relieved to see a few other passengers scattered throughout the car. However, as the train moved further away from the city center, passengers began exiting one by one, leaving me alone. Initially, I didn't think much of it, assuming my stop would come up soon. Just as I started to relax, a man entered from the adjoining car. He looked disheveled, eyes darting around nervously before locking onto mine. Immediately uneasy, I diverted my gaze, hoping he would pass without interaction. Unfortunately, he approached directly, stopping a bit too close for comfort, and asked quietly for spare change. Despite my polite refusal, he persisted, growing increasingly agitated and repeating his request. My discomfort escalated sharply as he continued lingering nearby, staring intently even after I repeatedly declined. My anxiety spiked, trapped alone in the confined space of the subway car. When the train finally reached the next station, I quickly got off, hoping to distance myself from him. To my alarm, he exited behind me. I tried to convince myself it was merely coincidence, but as I hurried through the dimly lit station, I felt his presence following closely behind. My heart pounded as I quickly navigated up to the street level, desperate for any place open and populated at that late hour. Spotting a small deli, brightly lit and open, I ducked inside swiftly, glancing behind me to see the man lingering outside, watching me momentarily before continuing slowly down the street. Shaken, I stayed in the safety of the deli, gathering my composure before cautiously heading back to my accommodation. Even though nothing further happened, the unsettling encounter has stayed with me. To this day, I'm careful about traveling alone at night. I accepted a job at a small startup located in a somewhat isolated business complex on the outskirts of Atlanta. The job itself was great, and the people friendly, but due to tight deadlines, I often found myself working late into the night. The office complex would empty by evening, leaving me entirely alone in the building, something I initially didn't mind. However, after a few months, I started noticing strange occurrences during my late-night sessions. It began subtly. Faint noises, like footsteps echoing down empty hallways or doors, softly closing in distant parts of the building. At first, I brushed it off as the normal sounds of an empty office building settling. But one evening, as I was deep into my work, a loud crash startled me. Heart racing, I cautiously got up to investigate, finding a chair overturned in the middle of the hallway, nowhere near where it normally sat. Confused and increasingly uneasy, I righted the chair and quickly returned to my desk, trying to rationalize the situation. From that point on, incidents escalated. Lights would flicker, seemingly randomly, even after maintenance checks confirmed everything was functioning properly. More disturbingly, I began to frequently find items moved or misplaced, always in places I knew I hadn't left them. One particularly late night while typing away at my desk, a sudden chill ran down my spine, and I felt a strong sensation of being watched. Spinning around quickly, I caught a brief glimpse of a shadow passing swiftly by the doorway, disappearing down the hall. Terrified, I grabbed my belongings, hurriedly shut down my computer, and bolted from the building. The following day, unnerved but determined to find answers, I spoke with coworkers who admitted experiencing similar unsettling events, but had never discussed them openly. Realizing I wasn't alone in my fears offered little comfort. Eventually, unable to endure the anxiety and dread, I switched jobs, leaving the startup behind. Even now, working elsewhere, memories of those eerie nights alone in the empty office haunt me, a stark reminder that sometimes isolation can bring forth fears we never knew existed. A few summers back, craving a break from the stress of everyday life, I rented a beach house on a secluded stretch of the Oregon coast. The property was really nice, perched atop cliffs overlooking the Pacific, surrounded by dense woods that provided a comforting sense of privacy. It seemed like the ideal place to unwind and find some peace. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. Tranquil mornings filled with coffee and ocean views, long walks on the beach and evenings spent reading by a cozy fireplace. Yet as peaceful as the setting was, I couldn't shake an odd feeling of unease creeping into my evenings. At first, I dismissed it as being unused to the isolation and unfamiliar surroundings. However, one evening while reading, I distinctly heard footsteps crunching on gravel outside. Peering cautiously out the window, I saw nothing but the dark outlines of trees and the faint glow of moonlight on the ocean waves. Convincing myself it was likely wildlife, I returned to my book, but the sense of discomfort lingered. The next night, things got outright spooky. I woke suddenly, startled by the unmistakable sound of someone slowly walking around the perimeter of the house. Heart racing, I turned off the lights and carefully peeked through a crack in the curtains, spotting the shadowy figure of a man moving slowly and purposefully around the house. Panic surged through me as I watched, frozen with fear. Eventually, the figure disappeared into the darkness, but sleep eluded me the rest of the night. The following morning, I found clear footprints circling the house, confirming someone had indeed been there. Immediately reporting the incident to local authorities, I learned there had been similar disturbances reported nearby, but no one had ever been caught. Too shaken to remain, I packed my belongings and left the beach house early, unable to shake the chilling sensation of vulnerability I'd experienced. Years later, the memory still unsettles me deeply. I was driving cross-country alone, taking scenic back roads through rural areas to enjoy the landscape and avoid traffic. It was late fall, and the changing leaves and crisp air made the journey enjoyable and peaceful. One afternoon, I decided to take a detour onto a quiet country road, aiming to explore some of the less traveled paths. As evening approached, the sun dipped behind the horizon, and the road grew darker and more isolated. My phone signal was fading in and out, but I wasn't overly concerned, confident that I'd reach a town soon enough. However, after a while, the road became narrower and less maintained, surrounded by thick woods on both sides. The pleasant adventure suddenly began feeling more unsettling. The darkness quickly intensified, and the dense trees overhead blocked out the remaining daylight, making my headlights the only source of visibility. Soon after, I noticed headlights in my rear-view mirror, another vehicle approaching swiftly from behind. At first, I felt relieved at the presence of another traveler, but the relief soon turned to anxiety as the vehicle tailgated aggressively close, refusing to pass despite having plenty of room. Unease growing, I slowed down, hoping they would go around me. Instead, the car matched my speed, maintaining the uncomfortable closeness. My heart rate spiked, panic settling in as I realized how vulnerable and isolated I was. With no clear destination in sight, I continued driving, desperately hoping for a sign of civilization or an intersection. After several tense miles, the vehicle finally pulled back slightly, giving me momentary relief. But just as quickly, its headlights suddenly vanished altogether, plunging the road behind me into total darkness. Alarmed, I glanced in the mirror repeatedly, uncertain of what had happened. Minutes passed, the tension building unbearably. Suddenly, ahead of me, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Instinctively, I swerved sharply, narrowly avoiding a collision. Heart racing, I stopped briefly, looking back to see the figure standing motionless, silhouetted ominously against my brake lights. Fear surged through me, and I immediately accelerated away. Finally, reaching a small town, I quickly found a gas station, my hands still shaking. Inside, I described the incident to the attendant, who nodded knowingly, explaining that similar encounters had been reported on that very stretch of road. The chilling realization that I wasn't alone in my experience provided little comfort. Even now, years later, the memory remains vividly unsettling. I spent a summer working as a counselor at a secluded summer camp nestled deep within the woods of northern Michigan. I loved the natural beauty, peaceful environment, and camaraderie among the staff. For most of the summer, things went smoothly, filled with sunny days and laughter around nightly campfires. One weekend, after all the campers had gone home and the staff had left to visit town, I chose to stay behind alone to enjoy the solitude. At first, it felt wonderfully peaceful. The whole camp empty and silent, surrounded only by the gentle rustling of trees and distant wildlife. However, as evening approached, I became aware of an unsettling feeling creeping into my solitude. Dismissing it initially as imagination, I continued preparing dinner, attempting to ignore the growing unease. But later, while sitting by the campfire, I heard distinct footsteps approaching from the woods. My heart quickened and I scanned the trees nervously, seeing nothing but shadows and darkness. Despite my attempts to rationalize the noises as animals, the footsteps returned repeatedly, always drawing closer and then retreating into the darkness, as though someone was circling just beyond sight. Anxiety grew into panic, especially when I began hearing faint whispers carried on the breeze, barely audible, yet unmistakably human. Deciding I couldn't remain outside any longer, I quickly extinguished the fire and retreated to my cabin, locking every door and window securely. Still, throughout the night, the unsettling presence persisted. I heard slow, methodical footsteps circling the cabin, stopping occasionally to test doors or peer into windows. Paralyzed by fear, I remained silent and motionless until dawn. When daylight finally arrived, I cautiously ventured outside, discovering clear footprints in the soft ground around the cabin, confirming someone had indeed been watching me throughout the night. Immediately reporting the incident, I learned similar disturbances had happened previously, but had always gone unexplained. The experience haunted me long after summer ended, permanently altering my view of solitude and isolation. A couple of years back, after landing a great job downtown, I regularly parked my car in an underground garage beneath the office building. During the day, the garage buzzed with activity, full of cars and people bustling to and from work. At night, however, it transformed into an eerie, deserted place, dimly lit and echoing with every step. One night, after working late, I headed down to the garage, eager to get home. As I stepped out of the elevator, I was immediately struck by how quiet and deserted it felt. The usual comfort of familiarity was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness that made the shadows seem deeper and darker than usual. As I walked toward my car, the sound of my footsteps echoed loudly. But soon I realized they weren't alone. Another set of footsteps matched mine from somewhere behind me. Glancing nervously over my shoulder, I saw no one. Yet the sound continued, keeping pace precisely. Picking up my speed, the footsteps quickened behind me as well, fueling my growing anxiety. Finally reaching my car, I hurriedly unlocked it, my heart racing. Just as I pulled the door open, movement caught my eye. Someone stood partially hidden behind a concrete pillar, watching me silently, motionless. Panic surged through me as I quickly got inside, locking the doors immediately and fumbling to start the engine. As the car roared to life, the figure stepped slowly out from behind the pillar, approaching my car with deliberate, unhurried steps. Terrified, I sped away, barely glancing back in the rearview mirror. Afterward, I reported the incident to building security, who reviewed footage showing a stranger loitering and hiding in various parts of the garage over multiple nights. Security measures were heightened, and while the individual was never identified, the memory left me deeply unsettled. From then on, I never parked there again after hours, haunted by the unnerving encounter. A few years ago, while traveling alone late at night through rural Texas, I realized I was dangerously low on fuel. After what seemed like an eternity, relief washed over me when I finally spotted a dimly lit gas station, the first sign of civilization I'd seen for miles. Pulling in, I immediately noticed the station seemed nearly abandoned, making me feel strangely uneasy as I stepped out to fill my tank. As I began pumping gas, the faint creak of the convenience store door opening caught my attention, revealing an elderly man standing silently in the doorway, expressionless and staring intently in my direction. His gaze made my skin crawl, and I quickly turned away, focusing on finishing up. Just as I replaced the gas nozzle, Headlights pierced through the darkness, illuminating the area. A battered sedan pulled up slowly, stopping at the pump directly opposite mine. The engine idled for several moments before a man stepped out, his appearance slightly disheveled, his movements slow. He stood there silently, looking straight ahead as if completely unaware of my presence, yet somehow his posture felt strangely tense and unnatural. Feeling increasingly uncomfortable, I moved toward the store to pay, the elderly man at the doorway never breaking his unnerving stare. Inside, the store was dim, filled with outdated products covered in dust. Approaching the counter, I awkwardly greeted the elderly man, who remained silent as he took my payment, his eyes never leaving mine. The atmosphere was suffocating, the quiet tension almost unbearable. Exiting the store quickly, my heart sank as I noticed the other man from the sedan now standing near my car, inspecting it closely, almost too closely for comfort. Gathering my courage, I approached cautiously, asking if everything was okay. He turned slowly, his eyes oddly unfocused, and responded in a flat, monotone voice. "Nice car. You traveling alone?" The question sent chills down my spine, and I quickly muttered something vague about friends waiting nearby, my instincts screaming to get out of there as quickly as possible. He didn't respond further, just stood there silently, watching as I hurriedly climbed into my vehicle, locking the doors immediately. Starting my engine, I glanced briefly back, seeing both the elderly store owner and the strange man standing side by side, still watching as I pulled away into the night. I drove for hours without stopping, heart pounding, unable to shake the memory of that unsettling encounter. Even now, years later, the isolated gas station and the eerie interaction remain vivid in my mind. One summer weekend, I decided to take a break from the city and rented a small cabin in the woods of northern Wisconsin. It was just supposed to be a relaxing weekend alone, fishing, hiking, and chilling out by the lake. The cabin was pretty basic, nothing fancy, but perfect for some quiet time away. The first day was great. I spent it fishing, grilling dinner, and just enjoying nature. But when night came, things started feeling a little weird. I was sitting by the fire outside when I noticed that everything had gotten really quiet, like too quiet. No crickets, no birds, nothing. It was weird enough that I decided to pack up and head inside. Later, as I was falling asleep, I heard what sounded like footsteps outside. At first, I thought maybe it was just animals, but then I realized the sound was way too heavy. Definitely human footsteps. My heart started racing, and I got up quietly, peeking out the window carefully. At first, I didn't see anything. But then I spotted a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the trees, looking directly toward the cabin. Freaked out, I double-checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked tight. Eventually, the footsteps stopped, and the figure disappeared. Still nervous, I decided to stay awake for a bit, listening closely. But eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I started drifting off again. Just as I was about to fall asleep, a loud crash jolted me awake. The front door had been kicked hard enough to splinter the frame. Adrenaline pumping, I grabbed my handgun from the nightstand, aiming it toward the doorway. A man shouted from outside, demanding to be let in. When he kicked the door again, I fired a warning shot into the floor near the door, the sound echoing sharply through the cabin. Instantly, I heard panicked voices and footsteps retreating into the darkness. Peeking through the shattered doorway, I saw several figures disappearing into the woods. Shaking uncontrollably, I didn't waste any time. I packed my things as quickly as possible, my heart pounding as I kept an eye out for any sign they'd return. Within minutes, I was driving away, leaving the isolated cabin behind. That terrifying night stayed with me for a long time. forever changing how I viewed the quiet isolation of the wilderness. A couple of years ago, I decided to get into running to clear my head after stressful days at work. Since my schedule was packed during the day, I usually went jogging late at night in my quiet suburban neighborhood. I liked it. The streets were peaceful, empty, and calming, especially after midnight. One night, I headed out later than usual, around 1 a.m. Everything was quiet as expected, with just the soft hum of streetlights and my own footsteps keeping me company. About halfway through my usual route, I noticed something strange. A parked van I hadn't seen before, sitting alone beneath a flickering street lamp. I didn't think much of it initially, figuring it was just a random vehicle. But as I passed by, I heard the van's engine quietly start up. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept jogging, trying not to overthink it. However, after a minute, I realized the van was slowly trailing me at a distance. My heart started pounding harder, and I quickly took a sharp turn down a side street, hoping to shake off the van. To my horror, it turned too, still following closely behind. I picked up my pace, anxiety building rapidly. When I glanced back again, the van accelerated slightly, closing the gap between us. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted down another street, trying desperately to lose it. Just as I was about to reach my own street, the van suddenly pulled up alongside me, window rolling down to reveal a man staring intensely at me, his face partially hidden in shadows. He asked in an oddly calm voice if I needed a ride, claiming he was just concerned for my safety. The eerie calmness in his voice made me even more scared. I refused quickly, voice shaking, and hurried away. The van lingered for a moment, then slowly drove off, finally disappearing into the night. Breathless and shaken, I sprinted the rest of the way home, constantly checking over my shoulder. Once inside, doors locked tightly, I collapsed onto the couch, trembling uncontrollably. I never went jogging alone late at night again. About 2 years ago, I moved into an apartment building in a small town outside of Denver. It was a quiet place, with friendly neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. My job had me working odd hours, sometimes getting home late at night, and I usually didn't pay much attention to who was coming or going. After settling in, I started noticing my next-door neighbor, an older guy named Mark. He was quiet, rarely seen, and when we did cross paths, he'd just nod politely without saying much. At first, I didn't think anything of it. He seemed harmless enough, just shy or maybe a bit socially awkward. But gradually, I began noticing some odd things. Whenever I came home late from work, I'd see his window blinds move slightly, as though someone was watching me. Initially, I shrugged it off, thinking I was imagining things, but it happened consistently, night after night. Then one night, as I arrived home even later than usual, I noticed Mark standing by his window, staring straight at me through the blinds, his face barely visible, but clearly watching me. A chill ran down my spine, but I quickly headed inside, locking my door securely. After that incident, things started escalating. I found strange notes left anonymously at my doorstep, nothing threatening, but oddly personal and unsettling, mentioning my habits and schedule. My unease turned to fear, and I decided to install a small security camera outside my apartment. Within a few days, the camera recorded Mark sneaking quietly to my door late at night, placing another note. Terrified, I confronted him cautiously the next day, asking him directly about the notes. He just stared blankly, denied everything, and quietly retreated inside his apartment, locking the door firmly behind him. The behavior continued, becoming increasingly aggressive. One night, I woke up to hear someone softly trying my door handle. Frozen with fear, I quietly checked my camera feed to see Mark, attempting to open my locked door. Immediately, I called the police, whispering desperately into the phone as Mark continued quietly trying the handle. Police arrived quickly, catching Mark still at my door. they discovered he'd been obsessively documenting my comings and goings for weeks, planning to enter my apartment for reasons unknown. Mark was arrested, and I quickly moved out, unable to stay in that building another night. Even though it's been years, I still feel a deep unease when recalling that experience. It taught me a terrifying lesson about how danger can lurk behind even the most seemingly harmless faces. One day I was driving alone from Ohio to Florida to visit family. It was a long drive, and I planned to take breaks at rest stops along the way. Around 1 a.m., exhausted and desperate to stretch my legs, I pulled into a quiet rest stop somewhere in rural Georgia. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a couple of cars scattered around, which was typical for that hour. As soon as I stepped out, I felt a bit uneasy. The lights were dim, and the silence was almost overwhelming, broken only by the distant hum of passing cars on the interstate. Ignoring my growing discomfort, I walked toward the restrooms, eager to get in and out quickly. Inside, the restroom was empty, but unsettlingly silent. As I washed my hands, the door creaked open behind me. Glancing in the mirror, I saw a man standing quietly by the entrance, watching me. His stare was intense and uncomfortable, making my skin crawl instantly. Trying not to panic, I nodded briefly and quickly headed toward the door, avoiding eye contact. But as I walked past him, he stepped slightly in front of me, blocking my way out. He smiled, a bit too widely, and started making awkward small talk, asking strange questions about where I was going, if I was traveling alone, and why I was out so late. My heart started pounding, every instinct screaming to leave as quickly as possible. I politely but firmly told him I had to go and quickly moved around him, pushing through the door and back outside. To my horror, he immediately followed, walking closely behind me toward my car. Panicking, I picked up my pace, fumbling with my keys as I reached the vehicle. He continued trailing me, repeatedly asking me not to leave yet, his voice growing more desperate and aggressive. Finally reaching my car, I jumped in and locked the doors immediately, heart racing. The man stood inches from my window, staring intensely, his face twisted with frustration. Terrified, I started the engine and quickly pulled away, watching anxiously in the rearview mirror until the rest stop faded into the distance. I didn't stop again until reaching my destination, shaken and deeply disturbed by the encounter. To this day, I never use rest stops late at night. This happened a few years back. I worked as a pizza delivery driver in a small town. Most nights were pretty routine. Drop-offs at regular houses, quick exchanges and friendly smiles. But one evening, near closing time, we got an order from an address I didn't recognize. It was on the outskirts of town, in an area known for being pretty isolated. But I figured it'd be a quick trip before I headed home. As I drove toward the address, the roads got darker and narrower, with fewer streetlights and more trees. My GPS led me down a long gravel road that eventually opened up to a house hidden behind tall, overgrown hedges. Immediately, something felt off. There were no lights on, no sign of anyone waiting for the pizza. The place looked abandoned. Uneasy, I parked and cautiously approached the front door, knocking lightly and announcing the delivery. No answer. After a minute, I knocked louder, but still nothing. Just as I was about to leave, a dim porch light flickered on, revealing a man standing just inside the screen door, staring silently at me through the mesh. Startled, I stepped back slightly, but politely greeted him and held out the pizza. He didn't say anything, just stared for a long moment before finally opening the door slowly. The way he moved was slow and deliberate, his eyes never leaving mine. Something about him was deeply unsettling. He took the pizza and handed over some cash, but then asked if I could come inside for a moment, claiming he needed help moving something heavy. Every alarm bell in my head went off immediately, and I quickly refused, making up an excuse about needing to get back to the store. He stepped closer, insisting quietly, his voice cold and almost threatening. My heart raced as I backed away quickly, repeating my refusal firmly. Without waiting for another response, I turned and practically sprinted back to my car, jumping in and locking the doors behind me. As I sped away, I glanced back to see the man still standing motionless in the doorway, pizza box in hand, watching me drive off. Shaken and disturbed, I reported the incident to my manager, who immediately blacklisted the address. Years later, the memory of that late-night delivery still haunts me. When I first moved to a new city for college, I rented a basement apartment because it was affordable and close to campus. The place was small, a little damp, and kind of dark, but it seemed okay for what I needed. At first, everything was fine. It was quiet. My neighbors were pretty friendly, and I had plenty of space to myself. But soon, things started feeling off. Small stuff at first. I'd come home and find things slightly out of place. Doors open that I knew I'd closed, or lights on that I definitely turned off. I thought maybe I was just being forgetful, stressed out from schoolwork. Then, one night, I woke up suddenly around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure why at first, but then I clearly heard footsteps moving around upstairs. The landlord lived upstairs, but he was out of town. My heart started racing as I realized someone else had to be up there. I sat up, listening carefully, hoping whoever it was would leave soon. But instead, the footsteps moved toward the basement door. My stomach dropped when I heard the door open slowly, the stairs creaking under someone's weight as they descended quietly. Frozen in fear, I grabbed my phone and quickly hid behind my bedroom door, holding my breath. The intruder moved slowly around the apartment, quietly opening cabinets and drawers, searching through my things. Terrified, I dialed 911 as silently as possible, whispering my location and begging them to hurry. As the intruder moved toward my bedroom, my heart pounded in my chest. Just as he reached my doorway, flashlight beams sweeping across the room, police sirens suddenly wailed outside, lights flashing. The intruder immediately turned and bolted back up the stairs, footsteps fading rapidly. Police arrived moments later, checking the apartment and finding clear evidence someone had broken in through a window upstairs. They searched the area but never found the intruder. Shaken and traumatized, I moved out as quickly as possible, unable to stay another night in that basement apartment. Even now, years later, I feel a chill recalling that night. One time I was working a late shift job across town, and I didn't have a car, so I usually took the bus home. Most nights were pretty uneventful. The bus was mostly empty, just me and maybe one or two other tired passengers. One night, after finishing my shift around midnight, I got on the bus as usual, settling into a seat near the back. At first, everything was normal, with just one other person sitting up front, quietly minding their business. After a couple of stops, another passenger got on, a man who immediately gave off a strange vibe. He didn't sit down right away, just stood near the driver, looking around the bus nervously. Eventually, he slowly made his way to the back, sitting directly across from me despite plenty of empty seats elsewhere. I tried not to pay him much attention, but I could feel his eyes constantly glancing in my direction. My gut told me something was off, but I kept telling myself I was overreacting. After a few minutes, he started talking to me, asking weird questions, like where I worked, what my plans were for the night. I gave vague, short answers, clearly uncomfortable. But he didn't take the hint and kept pushing, becoming more intrusive and aggressive in his questioning. Feeling panicked, I pressed the button for the next stop, deciding I'd rather walk home the rest of the way than stay on the bus with this guy. When the bus finally stopped, I quickly got off, but so did he, stepping off right behind me. Now fully alarmed, I hurried down the sidewalk, glancing back to see him following at a distance, his pace matching mine exactly. My heart started racing, and I ducked quickly into a nearby convenience store, telling the clerk I was being followed. The clerk immediately helped by locking the doors and calling the police. We saw the man linger outside for a few minutes, staring intently at the store before finally disappearing into the darkness just as police arrived. Although officers checked the area, they couldn't find him. I got home safely that night, but the experience shook me deeply. Since then, I've always trusted my instincts more carefully. One Friday afternoon, I decided to catch a late-night showing of a movie I'd been wanting to see. It was a weekday, and I knew the theater wouldn't be crowded, but when I got there, it was completely empty. Just me, and rows of empty seats. At first, I thought this was awesome, having the whole theater to myself. As the previews started, I settled comfortably into my seat, enjoying the solitude. About halfway through the movie, I suddenly heard the theater door open behind me. Glancing back briefly, I saw a man enter and choose a seat just a couple of rows behind mine. It seemed odd since the theater was entirely empty, but I shrugged it off, figuring he just liked that spot. However, as minutes passed, I noticed he wasn't really watching the movie. Instead, he kept glancing around the theater, and each time, his gaze lingered longer on me. My heart started beating faster, and a feeling of unease began creeping in. I tried to ignore him, focusing back on the movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After a few tense moments, I heard him get up and quietly move closer, now just a single row behind me. Panicking inside, I quickly got up, pretending to head to the restroom. As I exited, I glanced back and saw him staring intensely, unmoving in his seat. Feeling unsafe, I hurried to find a theater employee, explaining the situation quickly. The employee took my concerns seriously and escorted me back to gather my belongings. When we returned, the man had vanished completely, nowhere to be found in the theater. Unsettled and shaken, I decided to leave immediately. The whole drive home, I kept checking my mirrors nervously, still feeling his eyes on me. Even now, years later, the memory of that strange encounter makes me wary of empty spaces and reminds me how quickly isolation can turn into danger. When I was younger, I moved into a new house in a quiet neighborhood. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved politely but kept to themselves, which suited me perfectly. Everything seemed peaceful and normal until one unsettling night. It started with small incidents. At first, I'd occasionally notice someone lingering near my house late at night, just standing on the sidewalk, staring in the direction of my home. I brushed it off initially, convincing myself they were just a late-night walker or someone waiting for a ride. But these occurrences began happening more frequently, always late, always unsettling. Then one night, after returning from a long day at work, I noticed the motion-sensitive porch light was already on as I approached. Uneasy, I checked around but didn't see anyone. Shrugging it off, I went inside, double-checking that all doors and windows were locked before settling into bed. Just as I was drifting off, I was startled awake by a sudden loud knock at my front door. Confused and annoyed, I glanced at my phone. It was just past midnight. I couldn't think of anyone who would show up this late, especially without calling first. Hesitantly, I got up and moved quietly to the front door, looking through the peephole. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a stranger standing there, facing away from the door, motionless. He stood completely still, not moving or speaking, just waiting, silently. Heart racing, I decided not to answer and quietly stepped away, hoping he'd leave soon. But instead, he knocked again, this time louder and more insistently. My anxiety surged as I peered out once more, noticing he had moved closer, now facing directly toward the peephole, as if he knew I was watching. Terrified, I backed away, reaching for my phone to dial 911. As I whispered my situation to the dispatcher, the knocking continued, becoming increasingly aggressive. Suddenly it stopped, replaced by silence so heavy I could feel it. Minutes later, police arrived, their lights illuminating the front yard. When they knocked at the door, I cautiously opened it, explaining the situation. They searched the area thoroughly but found no one. Only footprints in the grass leading around the side of the house, indicating someone had circled my home several times. A few nights passed without incident, though I remained deeply unsettled. Then, late one evening while getting ready for bed, I happened to glance out my bedroom window and saw the same figure standing motionless at my neighbor's porch. Without hesitation, I immediately called the police, explaining it was the same person from before. Officers arrived swiftly this time, catching the man still lingering on the neighbor's porch. They arrested him on the spot. I later learned he had a history of similar incidents, stalking and harassing homeowners around the area. Even though he was finally caught, I moved out shortly afterward, unable to shake the lingering fear and sense of vulnerability. The memory of that midnight knock and the silent figure outside my door still haunts me.